Welcome to this audio presentation on the social value of housing. I'm Peter Murray, Curator-in-Chief at New London Architecture. As we all adjust and adapt to new ways of working as a result of COVID-19, speakers from this conference, which was due to take place on the 19th of March, before we knew about the lockdown, have kindly recorded their presentations so that we can share them with you. Social value is currently poorly understood, although it is high on local authority and GLA agendas. These audio presentations will describe the tools that exist so that social value can be measured, monetized, and mapped. They will also highlight examples of current best practice in this field. First, you will hear from Professor Flora Samuel from the University of Reading. She will share her research on creating the social value toolkit that has been devised by a working group that Flora led and chaired.
Hello, my name is Flora Samuel. I'm a professor at the University of Reading, and my research subject is the social value of architecture. And I'm going to talk about the social value toolkit for architecture, which is bottom-up initiative developed with this group, the Research Practice Leads. These are people who lead on research in practice. We meet quarterly across different people's offices and talk about areas of concern for research. And one of our task and finish groups was the social value toolkit, coming from those practitioners who have spent a lot of time having to write the various social value documentation for bids, pre-qualification questionnaires and so on, who identified a real need for guidance in this area. So the aim of this social value toolkit was to prepare something quite super simple, really, as a prompt to get practices going on social value. Unfortunately, a lot of bids require practices to fill in detail, which really, and the bids questionnaires themselves are just entirely unsuited to architecture practice. They're based on engineering and construction formats. And I really believe as a group that we have to resist this and ask for better ways in which to record social value generally. What are the constituents of social value in the built environment? Well, the research I've been doing on this area leads me to believe that there are about 5 threads. I've identified 5 threads so far, and these really are not very well discussed or appreciated in literature. The first one is the obvious one, jobs and apprenticeships. We know about that. Construction companies are quite geared up to demonstrating the jobs and apprenticeships that they produce. Second one is the well-being generated by the design itself. Now, this is a totally neglected area, and this is the area that we tackle in the social value toolkit. Another outcome is the learning developed through construction, and that, in a way, that's an internal outcome within organisations of all manner of different kind of inputs relating to corporate social responsibility and other things in that zone. Perhaps a more important one is designing with the community, because when you do participatory research and participatory work with communities on designing and building together, there are immense benefits in terms of learning. The last one I think is going to race up the agenda very fast, and this is building with local materials, building with local services, the social value of local procurement. And I just think very soon we'll be doing BIM models, which will be telling us where the materials that we specify are coming from, and not before time, given that there's a great trade deficit with the UK construction industry. Okay, why make a social value toolkit for architecture? Well, for time and research on looking at how architects demonstrate their value. I wrote this book, Why Architects Matter, which was all about this area. What I find is that architects really don't like thinking themselves as an increment of economic value. They fear the dragon of measurement culture. But the fact of the matter is we live in an audit culture, And we have to face this dragon of measurement culture head on, because if we don't do it, somebody else will. So we did this project to see how design value might be defined at neighbourhood scale in housing. And this was a forensic literature review. And really, it's not very well defined at all. The conclude was that actually design value is the sum of economic value, environmental value, and social value. Now, this is the commonly used triple bottom line of sustainability. And but we have to frame what we do in these terms all the time, rather than saying design value, what's that? Don't know what it is. Let's do something else. We have to try and get the message across that it's about these three things. And indeed, these things are familiar because they're part of the national planning policy frame. And indeed, they are central to the Treasury Green Book, the way that the government, in theory, makes its decisions about things. Social value came in a big time with the Public Services Social Value Act 2012. And if you're very serious about investigating social value, you'd see that whether social value relates to the built environment is quite obscure, but the fact of the matter is that people do believe that it does, and that local authorities are chunking into action around the social value of procurement and building and so on. Now, this is on reasons, not least because of this thing, procuring for value, and this is the report by Anne Bentley and the Construction Leadership Council, which was really saying in the future we should be doing value-based procurement, outcomes-based procurement. And that means getting rid of all these old building contracts which really favour nobody much. I mean, only favour lawyers and people who are interested in disagreements, and join together as construction teams, possibly with the benefit of integrated project insurance, join together as teams to deliver certain outcomes. And in clever clients are starting to do this, not least Anglia Water is one that Anne Bentley refers to. They're interested in achieving, are starting to do this, not least Anglia Water is one that Anne Bentley refers to. They're interested in achieving outcomes specifically for their customers. And that involves a very different way of working. Now, think about social value measures because of the digital twins. In the future, digital models are going to be used to test and simulate the behaviour of city systems. Now, I think it'd be quite scary if we had city systems that made no mention of social value and the impact on people. So that's just one of the many digital reasons why we have to get our ducks in order on social value, so that we can feed into all manner of technical systems that are being developed right now. So, Value Toolkit for Housing, what is it? Well, as I mentioned, it was a bottom-up initiative, and our aim was to develop a practical, simple toolkit for evidencing and measuring the social value of good design for use in housing. You can actually use it in other sectors as well, without too much of a struggle. So we wanted to understand the impact of design through qualitative and quantitative post-occupancy evaluation. Post-occupancy evaluation is very, very rare in the UK industry, but I have to say that the UK is pretty much a world leader on post-occupancy evaluation, despite the fact it's so rarely done, and it's a real opportunity for industry. And I honestly can't see anything other than the fact that we are going to have to gather data on buildings and feed them into all manner of different kinds of data gathering tools. And also the aim of the Social Value Toolkit was to help decision makers include social value of design in policy and procurement. And we were asked specifically by MHCLG, who were collaborators in this entity, So what was the process? We identified some headline outcomes through a wellbeing through a literature review of existing wellbeing literature, and then we developed a series of sub-questions, working in workshops with multiple groups. And it was amazing the degree of consensus on what we needed to talk about there. And then the social value toolkit was revised and piloted by an assortment of practices in different ways. And then following feedback from the pilot, a library of questions has been developed for use by practice. And then at the same time as that, we had a range of amazing experts in social return on investment who trawled the literature to find out proxies that we could be using for measuring and monetizing the social value of good housing design. So just a few photos of the process. Began by a small little symposium at HTA, after a whole series of workshops at a sale and other documents we looked at in the literature review. And this is you can't really see what's going on here, but I just want to assure people that we worked hard at thinking about what these social value outcomes were. What we noticed is that all these different documents talk about roughly the same thing, but they have different words to use it. And of the New Economic Foundation, 5 Ways to Wellbeing is really, so that's one of our ultimate points of contact. So having gone through the literature review, we identified that good housing architecture can result in positive emotions, it can connect people, it can result in freedom and flexibility, and also participation. It can give people a say and therefore give rise to autonomy, which is an incredibly important welcome. These are just some of the places that we went to with practitioners and others, the pilot launch and so on. Developed a series of post-occupancy questions to enable people to start asking questions around this to people on projects that they've worked on. And also, if you add a question, you can say, you can add a question which helps you see how much people were feeling this before and after the project. And we, as I mentioned, trawled around for monetization proxies using the hacked social value bank, particularly useful one. Comes up with proxies like I talk to neighbours regularly. Now this has a monetization proxy of £4,511 per person per year, and you have to multiply it by a couple of other things, but at the end of the day you can come out with quite an interesting monetized outcome. And it sounds, for people who are suspicious of monetization, that may feel problematic, but actually social return on investment is quite a humane measure. We've had colleagues in a sale architects who worked through the process of using it, trying to develop a very simple way for architects to understand how they may start to monetize their work. And this is all going to be published in the Social Value Toolkit, which was supposed to come out in April, but has been delayed by our current situation, but will be soon, I'm sure. At the same time, there's a dimension to all this, which is mapping social value. So social value has a dimension, and we've been working on a research project in a state in Reading, where we're looking at how people feel about their area, using the proxies that we've been using in the Social Value Toolkit, but asking children, older people, all manner of people to draw and write on maps to say where they feel certain things. So the sort of maps that were produced, and when we produced these maps to various sort of community events and asked people to check and sense check the results. So this has ended up with maps that which we call the happy maps, which start to show areas where people feel a sense of connection, where people do certain activities, where people take notice of things, of nature, where people feel positive emotions. And then you can start to overlay these to make sort of heat maps of what's going on in certain areas. And there were very interesting things going on at this point in time in Reading, because they closed down a local swimming pool. So we were very able to monitor and show the social value impact of actually closing down the swimming pool in the local area. And we have realised while doing this project that these sort of maps are also useful. We're sending this to the Boundary Commission as evidence for why the electoral boundaries between constituencies ought to be changed, because we began to get a very strong sense of where the community was in this place. And we're heading towards a situation through other projects whereby we hope to develop maps where you can compare environmental, social and economic value on a map. And this, I hope, will lead to much more balance and holistic decision making around built and how things are built. So the next step for the Social Value Toolkit for Architecture, hopefully be published, it's going to include a library of questions which can be used for post-occupancy evaluation, and these relate closely to housing but can be adjusted to other sectors. It's going to include, as I mentioned, proxies for the monetisation of design, as well as a social return on investment, and these relate closely to housing but can be adjusted to other sectors. It's going to include, as I mentioned, proxies for the monetisation of design, as well as a social return on investment method statement. And it will also include guidance on ethical good practice for surveys, because architectural practitioners are often not used to doing quasi-social science type research, and this requires care with the ethics of data gathering, of anonymisation and so on. And generally, I do believe we've got a big job of work to do to help architectural practices manage data, but that's another story. So essentially, the SVT is designed as a prompt to architects to engage with social value, post-occupancy evaluation and data collection. But I would argue that the RIBA and other groups, the NLA and others, need to develop strategy to ready the profession for data-driven design, as data is set to become central to procurement very, very soon. And I think that architects need training in research strategy, data collection and management so that they are ready to face these changes head on. Thank you for listening, and these are the people who were involved in the consultation and the funding of this research project, which is very much a collective effort, and has been, I think, an amazing experience for all of us. Thank you.
Hilary Satchwell is a director of Tibbles. She will give a presentation on research carried out as part of the Good Growth by Design programme on the role of social infrastructure in enabling social integration.
Hello, hi, I'm Hilary Satchwell. I am a Director of Tibbles Planning and Urban Design, and I'm a Mayor's Design Advocate. And through this role, I'm also part of the Social Infrastructure Sounding Board, which includes Mayor's Design Advocates and the GLA team working to support this topic within the Good Growth by Design agenda. Good Growth by Design is a programme from the Mayor of London, which is around making sure that we are designing and making a city that works for all Londoners. And it's a really key part of the work that's been going on over the past 4 or 5 years. This piece of research I'm going to talk about today is something that's ongoing at the moment, and it's being done around the issues of social infrastructure and its role in promoting social inclusion. The work's being done by Hawkins, Brown and Social Life, working with the GLA team and supported by the MDA Sounding Board. So let's start with what is social infrastructure. This is where I can say, in inverted commas, it's complicated, and it's much more than generally people take this to understand this to be in many of the conversations we have about social infrastructure. And it's about much more than some bricks and mortar, more than space. It's about a whole ecosystem of types of facilities, groups, activities, and things that go on in our city. It includes services and facilities that meet local and strategic needs and contributes towards quality of life for Londoners. It includes obvious things like health, education, recreation, sports, community space, and also less obvious things, informal networks, local groups, community support, and there's lots of this going on. Why is this important? Well, social infrastructure is important for strong and inclusive communities. It provides support and involvement, and in particular, it can also help bring together people who might not often interact with each other on a day-to-day basis. It helps people have control of their lives by giving them opportunities to be involved, and helps tackle inequality by providing advocacy and advice. There is evidence of the value of social infrastructure in boosting neighbourliness, participation and equality. But the real difficulty, and the thing it's useful to think about here, is in restoring social infrastructure once it's gone away. And the really tricky thing for us around that is, how can we keep hold of something that we don't even know what it is or where it's happening, and how can we do more in regeneration and in particularly in housing to focus on creating, restoring or maintaining more than just the physical assets that look like they're delivering the social infrastructure and supporting social integration. So the Mayor has a vision for social integration that's a really key part of the programme that is ongoing and has been going on for the past 4 or 5 years. So social integration is the extent to which people positively interact and connect with others who are different to themselves. And it's determined by the level of equality between people and the nature of their relationships, but also their degree of participation in the communities in which they live. So somewhere that's really socially integrated is very mixed, people work with each other and generally support very sort of supportive and inclusive environment. Social integration is really important because it helps us grow trust and it allows communities to flourish. We also know that it helps deliver a range of other positive benefits, such as reducing mental health issues, preventing violent extremism, stopping vulnerable people from becoming isolated, and increasing social mobility. The Mayor's work on social integration has 4 key parts around relationships, participation, equality, and evidence. This evidence is really important to make sure that we understand what is happening. There's also evidence that shows that meaningfully engaging with someone from a different ethnicity, social background, or age group not only makes people more likely to view that particular group positively, but also helps them to have more confidence in people and the community as a whole. So, what's happening to social infrastructure at the moment? I'm sure this is something that people have a reasonable understanding of in terms of the bricks and mortar of social infrastructure, but public sector budget stresses and austerity are really putting a lot of pressure on local facilities and services at a time of increased need. There's growing interest in place-based or community-centred approaches, but it isn't necessarily clear on the motivations behind this. I think planning and urban design professionals are often still struggling with how to embrace the complexity of social infrastructure, but this is beginning to change. I'm really interested in how much of this issue, in terms of planning, is related to the things that we normally associated with physical planning and geography. So, planning and the use of land is describing the range of things that normally we're considering, but actually much of what social infrastructure is happening outside of this. How can we keep an eye on and keep a control on what we think should be happening in terms of social infrastructure and social integration if we don't even have the resources to map it, to understand it properly, and let alone measure what we should be doing? So, what's this research project about? So, the Mayor is taking a detailed look at the role and status of social infrastructure in London and how it supports social inclusion. Social Life and Hawkins Brown have been appointed to undertake research that considers the following questions. How does social infrastructure contribute to social integration? What are the new and innovative models of social infrastructure and how can these contribute to social integration? What methods are local authorities and other planning bodies using to understand the contribution that these make to each other? And this detailed research is being carried out through on-the-ground portraits of 3 London neighbourhoods, Catford, Surbiton and Homerton, case studies of innovative models, but also reviewing with London boroughs what's going on in terms of the work that they're doing. So there are some initial findings from this work that I'm just going to talk us through. So what supports social integration? What the research has established so far is that some types of uses can support social integration. For example, education and health services, libraries, community centres, play, recreation, sports facilities and places of worship. There is an interesting body of evidence on green infrastructure and outdoor spaces such as community gardens and communal space and their role in supporting social integration. High streets and town centres are also identified as important. There is also evidence that supports how services and provision for different groups can support social integration, for example by building confidence, engaging with wider systems and structures, and by enabling communication across cultural barriers. So, what have we learned from the research so far into different London neighbourhoods? Communication is really important and key to social integration, how groups communicate with each other, but also tell people that they exist. Events are really important, very good at bridging between groups, but can lack consistency in time or where they're delivered. There are few places bridging social class divisions. Formal infrastructure has a number of different roles and works very differently in different places. There's an interesting finding around exclusive versus inclusive spaces in groups, and there can be a trade-off between the level of support that they give, but also the universality and who they are for, and whether people feel that they get the depth of inclusion out of things that are very generalised. The role of some individuals as community connectors is really important. Common interests are a key catalyst. There are also risks around participation, and support and training is often necessary. The sense of community and ownership can be really vital for long-term sustainability. It can take a long time and be slow progress to get things together, but can be worth it in the end. Funding is complex and quite challenging at the moment where groups need funding. The local authority role can be very varied and changes over time, and faith spaces are really important for providing support for the most vulnerable, including homeless and those in food poverty. So some of the things we've learnt so far from different types of social infrastructure. Informal infrastructure can be more resilient to changes in public sector spending. Community ownership and management can be a useful tool. New models of participation are needed to broaden the base of who is involved in local decisions and in running services and facilities. Maintaining social infrastructure requires long-term funding solutions, an approach to planning that ensures that informal social infrastructure isn't stripped away just because people don't even necessarily notice or realise it's there or how important it is. Good research is needed to pinpoint the social infrastructure, including informal assets and networks that are adding value to local communities at the very local level are understood. And the physical presence of social infrastructure is not enough. This is perhaps the most important finding. There are many barriers to access, including social and financial ones, that are often less visible, and we need to think about this more carefully. From the work with local authorities, the findings so far are really indicating that there are very different lenses through which to see social infrastructure depending on the point of view and what you're trying to really try and resolve and what you're trying to get for it. There is a lack of evidence to support local authorities in planning and how they support social infrastructure, particularly the complexity of it, more than just the physical existence of a space or a facility. And the network of informal provision is poorly mapped and understood by local authorities, but it is also difficult to know who are the right bodies to understand all of this and whether actually it all needs to be in one place. Information on the types of provision is much better available in some areas than others. So, for example, the education provision is very well known, youth provision and faith provision tends to be less well mapped. Absolute need and shortfalls are hard to identify and therefore hard to require through planning, and I'm really interested in this as a key point. And the information that there is out there is just not accessible and shared to the extent that might be genuinely helpful. So the research really is thinking about a call to action, and my review of the initial conclusions are really this is about space on its own is not sufficient. We need to be thinking in a much more supportive way around the complexities of what social infrastructure is and what it can offer, and how it's delivered by a multitude of organisations, policy, ideas and people. There is a role for everyone in recognising the value and investing and sensitively supporting and designing with social integration in mind, but as I've said before, space alone is not enough. The team are still in the process of translating the research and findings and working with communities, planners and the Mayor to develop shared actions, and the report will be published in the summer of 2020. So I thought it was worth just reflecting on what this means for housing, or what this might mean for housing. And I think there's a couple of really key conclusions we can think about here, partly around understanding, if you're looking at a particular housing site or opportunity, what the pattern is of social infrastructure and social inclusion around that site and what the development or proposals on that site can do to improve that position. That doesn't always mean more space, but it might mean thinking about how it's managed differently. It might mean who runs it. It might mean the way it's physically arranged to actually be more accessible and open to different groups is also important. Housing type, tenure, mix and needs is really important to think about. What if there are particular groups who need additional support? Are there types of activities that people think are missing, or that they would like to get involved in? Or is even there just a better way of sharing information? The role of the provision in particularly promoting inclusion is important, and making sure that people feel that facilities are shared and that they're open to all, and that there aren't these unwritten rules that people think that, oh, that space isn't for me. We need to really work hard to make sure that that isn't the case. I think there's a really key challenge for us all around involving communities in management and programming of space. This can be really difficult to get off the ground, but really makes a difference to have a space and opportunities and activities that people can have some control and say over, rather than just be told with faceless rules about what might be delivered for them. And the other really interesting emerging finding is around generic space, and in the need to feel that we can make it so that all spaces can use, all types of groups can use a space, and that no one feels excluded because the space is set up for one particular use or other. There might be a thing that we're going down a route of making such generic space that it also doesn't really work very well for any or for many of those groups that might use it. They don't feel that that space is for them in a way that makes them engage and really think about how that social infrastructure, that activity is used, but also what its role is in bringing together different roles, different groups, different activities, and creating an improved position of social integration around and across that housing opportunity. Thank you for listening.
Jo McCafferty is a director at leading housing architects Levitt Bernstein. She will give an insight into delivering and unlocking social value at all levels, from small infill sites to estate regeneration and master plans.
Hello, I'm Jo McCafferty, a director at Levitt Bernstein Architects, and I'm here to talk about social value in practice in 3 case study projects that we have worked on, and also showing how social value is delivered in the practice itself and how we curate that cultural and ethical approach within our own office. So what I thought would be useful would be just to explain some of the levers that sit behind aspects of projects which help unlock huge amounts of social value of different types and scales within architectural projects that we've worked on. And you can see from these icons on this screen, from land ownership models all the way through to employment initiatives, the number of different levers that it's possible as an architect and as a client group and design team to employ to really maximise the amount of social value that's delivered in an architectural and design project. So these can range from, yes, how the land is owned, through to how various different stakeholders are engaged and consulted through the design process, how the project itself and the design team are procured in the first place, whether it's through design competition or something which is much more places value on cost, the financial mechanisms that sit behind the project in terms of what's financing it, what's funding the project, and where that funds come from, and what the controls of that funding might be, how the planners are involved and how planning policy can be unlocked to really deliver large amounts of social value, how residents and neighbourhoods and communities are engaged with through the design process, delivering community space projects, unlocking social value within education, and also how it's possible to engage with local businesses through local and social enterprise initiatives to unlock other streams of social value within all sorts of different types of projects, touching on the arts and cultural too, how projects are governed and the civic engagement processes and programs that sit behind them, and of course the employment initiatives, which everybody very much associate with social value within construction projects. So the first of the 3 case studies I'd want to talk through with you is a project that we've worked on with Islington, a very small project on a site in Finsbury Park for 13 homes. And this project was entirely funded by Islington. They did something quite radical. It started back in, I think it was 2013. And they did something quite radical in terms of the procurement of the project. So they set up a design competition, an open design competition for a housing project, which for a local authority actually is very unusual. And the scoring was very much weighted to the design approach rather than the experience of the team particularly. It was very much weighted on design. The first stages, I think, from memory, were also anonymous. And quite radically at that stage, I think they also involved the residents in writing the brief and being involved in the selection of the design team. It was a 2-stage design competition. There was London Festival of Architecture in the middle, where every one of the 52 submissions was exhibited in a really open, transparent manner. And we had quite a lot of opportunity through the second stage of the design to engage with the planners, to also engage with the residents, which again for a design competition is relatively rare for this sort of scale and it being a wholly social housing project. So these were some of the mechanisms that Islington employed, which tracking back you can see offered a really different opportunity in terms of the social value project. And for a very small project, it's been extraordinarily successful in so many different ways. It's unlocked a real problem within that part of Finsbury Park and the community living there. It's also helped people in that area really take pride in where they live and the surrounding gardens and green space. And it's really, it set a benchmark for Islington in terms of how to take really small sites across the borough and unlock opportunities for development, new housing or social housing, but also how to think beyond the red line and actually maximise the benefit of a project for the common good. So these were the levers that unlocked that particular project, some of it which I've touched on. The financial mechanisms, Islington very sensibly ring-fenced the funds for that project, so it was very clear what the budget was at the beginning and what we had to work to. It was even quite clear at the competition stage. I've talked about procurement already, but that was quite a radical thing to do. And the residents were at the heart of the process right from the outset. The planners were involved in the competitive process, involved in scoring and looking at the proposals before the selecting team moved forward with the project and were commissioned. And the whole of the different local authority departments were involved in the project team all the way through. So actually how the project evolved, we talked to the access officers, the highways teams, everybody was involved in the design team meetings all the way through. So that meant that every possible opportunity could be taken through the design and the progression of the scheme to unlock as many different aspects that were for the common good and the public good as possible. Just touching on the site itself, so it's this little skinny site you can see at the southern end of this slide. And we created 2 terraces building on the existing terraces to the south onto Victorian Street, St Thomas's Road and Burder Road. And it was a really important approach to us in terms of engaging with the residents of the tower, which was also owned by Islington, an over-occupied tower with lots of 1-bed and 2-bed flats in it, with families who desperately needed to be somewhere else. And so this scheme unlocked this much bigger virtuous circle of new housing for the residents of the tower that can then unlock smaller homes for couples and single people that then moved into the tower. And so we looked very hard at the space between the existing building and our new community that we were building for within the terraces, and looked at an opportunity to create a communal garden and connections between the two. So again, this opportunity to take the widest possible red line and really fold that into the project for the common good. And that garden has been an enormous success. It helped found a gardening club that joined the residents of the tower and the terrace together. We opened it with a really wonderful day where the residents of both terraces and the towers all met each other. And it's created this incredible social space that was completely underused and a real problem area at the base of the tower. It's created this wonderful garden which everybody uses, all ages. And that's fostered a sense of ownership and also a sense of community in that neighbourhood. And even thinking about the design of the family housing that was an essential part of the project, it was really very carefully thought through in terms of maximising family housing, maximising their private amenity space, but also thinking very carefully about privacy between dwellings and the amount of space you share with other people. So whether it's this garden space at the ground floor, whether it's the galleried access at upper levels into the apartments. We really thought about all of those things from a sort of community benefit point of view, very much thinking about homes and communities rather than units and development of a site. So the second project I want to talk you through is the Red Brick Estate in Islington, which is a slightly bigger scale. It's 55 homes and it's on an existing estate which sits right on Old Street, so it's very near Old Street Roundabout. It sits next to LSO St Luke's, which was a Grade 1 listed church that we worked on with the LSO and turned into performance space, rehearsal space and also education space. So very sensitive setting with lots of mature trees, an existing community who wanted to stay while development occurred, and an existing community centre and youth centre on this site, which needed to be rethought and made available to a much wider neighbourhood. So the mechanisms here, again, it was a design competition, a shortlisted design competition. The money was very carefully set aside for the project. It's all Islington land, but it was very carefully sort of curated in terms of the process and involving residents within our selection and also moving forward at every stage of the design. So the consultation process has been enormously intensive, talking to every single one of the existing residents on the site because new development is literally happening on their doorstep. Opportunities to look at green space within the development and really unlock the social value of those spaces. And through the relocation of the Spectrum youth services and the dentist and also providing a new community centre, we've been able to unlock a huge amount of education, training and skills programs within these spaces for all ages, which has been extraordinary. And probably the biggest aspect of social value that this delivers. So the site itself, you can see, sits close to Old Street, a kind of 2-minute walk away almost. And you can see those cruciform existing buildings on the plan, which are the existing housing, which is low rise with a series of green spaces peppered throughout it. And the existing the existing community centre is in the in this corner of the site, actually right next door to the LSO St Luke's. And what we looked at was really relocating that. So the existing building had its back to Old Street. It was very much part of the estate and very difficult to get into, very difficult to find the front door. And so therefore only used by a very, very small number of people. And it felt very important to Islington and to the residents that they had a wider reach and were very much embedded in the neighbourhood rather than just in the estate. As part of our works, we also were able to relocate these existing youth services called the Spectrum services and the dentist, which was also on site, into a much more suitable existing building, also on Old Street. So not far away, but actually provide much better facilities for them. And they have been enormously successful in terms of the social value that they've delivered to a much wider neighbourhood. And again, they have a showcase sort of front door, which is very obvious from the streets, very much part of the neighbourhood. So you can see from this that the work we looked at in terms of new housing and new shops, a new green space and upgrades to existing green space, there were enormous number of sort of very granular interventions, as well as these bigger scale interventions that we looked at to maximise the benefit for existing residents, but also for the safety and benefit for the whole wider neighbourhood. So from the small things, looking at new bins and bike stores and kind of really improving those in terms of people's day-to-day access and what they used, through to development of new housing, which was particularly more appropriate for some of the elderly population, and providing them accessible and also happy homes that were designed for older people. At the existing housing, there aren't any lifts, it's all walk-ups, and lots of elderly residents under occupying homes that also were deeply inaccessible. So again, this unlocked, like vaudeville, this virtuous circle of people being able to move into much more suitable new housing, and new families being able to move into some of the existing housing too. And so here you can see this elevation of some of the new housing on Old Street, which is on the left-hand side of the slide, and the integration of some of the lower-rise family accommodation, and then the kind of central east-west route, and you can see the St Luke's Spire at the end of that route. And issues of safety and movement for the wider area were also very much part of our thinking. So the stakeholder engagement was really quite broad. We involved a lot of input from local schools. School children and their parents tend to walk through the estates to and from school, and so that route is incredibly important to a much wider catchment than just the residents of the estates. And so we were very much thinking about what we could do beyond the red line, and Islington were amazing in terms of being really open to that. So not only rethinking the community centre and giving it a kind of front door on Old Street for the whole Bunt Hill area and that whole part of Old Street, sort of wider community draw, we also relocated this youth centre and worked with the youth of the existing centre to design the new one, and that was very much part of a sort of community outreach project. And worked really hard with Islington Youth and Leisure Services to make sure it was really flexible accommodation and didn't feel institutional, felt really a very open door to all ages. And it's been enormously successful. And it's also reactivated the ground floor of this existing building onto Old Street itself. And we also provide the new dentist surgery next door, which was operational really quickly and was a really important part of the regeneration of this whole area. So you can start to see some of the wonderful things that happen in Soapbox now. They have really state-of-the-art recording studios in the basement. They have a reach across all Islington schools. So there's a schools programme where kids that had no access to this type of facility now can come from far and wide across the borough and record, as well as there being drop-ins for local children. And lots of training opportunities, lots of IT training and education, and lots of events as well, which has been hugely successful. So suddenly there is this much bigger draw and much bigger benefit of actually a relatively contained, what could have been a relatively contained regeneration project on its estate. And you can start to see the numbers of people that this project has influenced in terms of the young people able now to access this facility. Really lovely that it's a pretty much 50-50 male-female balance too, and that was never the case before. And so it's changed the aspirations of lots of children and their parents. It has a very strong SEN also focus. So actually children that found it difficult to access these services can now be part of this, which is just extraordinarily sort of inspirational. And as you'd expect, we've done a lot of work with the local community led by Islington, making sure that the TMO have been part of the process right from the very beginning. They were part of our selection, and everything has been incredibly collaborative. We've had some tough moments along the way, but it's been really fantastic to keep it going with everybody, with all the residents in occupation and all the works happening around them, phase by phase. Also, the community centre was delivered first and opened its door first before any other aspect of the project, and so that also puts the local community much more at the forefront of the project. I should also mention that the whole project is 100% social housing, which is quite an extraordinary thing and chimes very much with Islington's ambition in their new local plan. The contractors, as you can imagine, the selection was pretty robust and tough, and Osborne won, and they've done an amazing job, and social value is something that they've really pushed through their programme. So lots of apprenticeships, lots of engagement of local people and local schools, particularly offering training, offering access to the site all the way through the construction process, and actually the contracting team going into schools themselves rather than just expecting schools to come to the site. So it's been fantastic, and a huge number of sort of training and employment opportunities that they've made happen, and it's all been very much for people. And the final project I wanted to talk you through is the Aberfeldy project I'm working on in Poplar. I've been working on this for the last 10 years. It's a big regeneration project, completely different scale to the other two. So 1,176 new homes on an existing estate to the north of East India Docks and East India DLR. It's an extraordinary estate, and we've worked with the residents from the word, and the social value kind of levers that have been employed and that have really unlocked the maximum amount of social value in this project have been, a lot of them have been to do with the 50-50 split between the private developer and the landowner and housing association Poplar Harker. The fact that it's set up as a 50-50 LLP. This has really meant that actually the community who are living through this very big, broad-ranging regeneration project and living through that change are very much at the heart of the whole process. There has been a huge investment in engagement and involvement of local residents, but also wider area stakeholders and local businesses. It again was run through design competitions, so the design was really much, and the approach was very much scored and at the heart of our selection. And there have been enormous numbers of opportunities that continue now that we're halfway through the regeneration, in terms of maximising the community benefit and through meanwhile projects, community space projects, and engagement with local schools and skills and education programmes. And so it's just wonderful to see how actually thinking in a very smart way at the beginning of a project, how you can use those levers to really social value. So the project has been really fascinating from a social value point of view. We have spent a lot of time with lots of the residents talking through options, proposals, what people's desires and aspirations for their new homes might be, but also their neighbourhoods, what types of facilities people need, what very specific groups within the community are missing and what can support them. And it's been a really interesting and valuable, inspiring process over the last 9-10 years. We've worked intensively with Make Good. It's Catherine here from Make Good at one of the consultation sessions with one of the residents. They've really unlocked these conversations too with us, running all sorts of really fascinating workshops. This one here was all about making chutney and cooking together, and how when you cook and you make things, you talk about food, this whole aspect of the site itself being part of an enormous part of London that was infused with a sense of spices and teas and things being traded from far afield, and thinking about, well, what's that narrative moving forward, actually what's being traded here now, what could be in the future, and how that might affect the design and the facilities that the regeneration can deliver. So really fascinating process. And some of these events are small scale and as powerful and as meaningful, and can unlock conversations that can then lead to the conversation shaping the design as some of the bigger scale things. So this was an event which was all about actually making embroidered bags, looking at the history of paisley and how the paisley pattern it springs up in all sorts of different circumstances and different configurations, including in these henna hands. But obviously with an amazing local Bengali community, actually it's been a fascinating process, sort of unlocking the discussion around gender, around cooking and culture, and around children and children's needs within that community. And a lot of that is through really inventive ways of communicating and engaging. We've had lots of sessions which have been about what do you want on your high street. Aberfeldy High Street is a very important high street, historic high street, and also fun events where actually you just want to have music and talk about your local neighbourhoods and how you craft together a master plan that sort of arises out of some of those conversations. So there's been lots of work with Meanwhile Space actually on the existing shop fronts. You can see some of the existing ones in the background there, and that's been fascinating. So all the shop fronts are now being painted. And there's been a lot of business planning going on with the existing businesses and business owners to what they want in the future and how we can incorporate them in the new master plan and the extension of the high street. So that's been fascinating. Also, we are opening our own design studios on site in one of these void shops, which will then provide a sort of front door to discussion and sort of showcase the master plan as it's evolving and be something of a community focus in terms of how we engage with the evolving master plan moving forward. And finally, I wanted to say a little bit about Levitt Bernstein and our practice culture and how it's really in our DNA to unlock social value in projects and how we continue to foster a sense of that within the practice itself. So our three tenets are those of community invention and advocacy, and they are very much at the core of our being as a practice. David Levitt and David Bernstein set up the practice in 1968, we're just over 50 years old. And they set up with a real intention of trying to improve the housing conditions of people who had very few choices in 1968. There was, again, a housing crisis at that moment, and David Levitt and David Bernstein chose not only to set up an architectural practice, but also Housing Association Circle 33. And that is very much at our heart of sort of thinking about actually how do we unlock architectural issues, but also social issues within projects in the most inventive way possible. So we spent our 50 years celebrating that aspect of our work. We raised £25,000 for Shelter through a number of different events. Shelter was founded 2 years before we were in 1966. And it felt the most appropriate way to celebrate a practice which actually is founded on the principles of everybody having a decent home to live in. So we had art auctions and very sort of interesting and fun. We also have invested a lot over the years in events like the LFA and think they're incredibly important in terms of talking about architecture to the widest possible audience. And this was an event that we hosted at Bermondsey Spa regeneration project that we've worked on for 10 years. And it was after the regeneration project was finished, and it was a mechanism to go back and talk to residents about how they felt about their new homes, almost a sort of creative way of post-occupancy evaluation, and to garner and gather stories from people that lived in the new buildings, lived in some of the existing buildings and housing, and saw it as their neighbourhoods. And similarly, we did the same thing in our studios in Dalston. This was an event for LFA a few years ago where we used origami and making origami to unlock conversations with local people about how Dalston was changing, how they felt about it, and kind of gathering those stories together in a really sort of important way as a local business. And we also work with Kairos, who are a local charity in Peckham, looking at homelessness with Kairos. They support the local community there in terms of getting people out of homeless situations and offering training and education and all sorts of support. So we had some wonderful sessions with Kairos created this installation outside our Dalston studios, which they came and made with us, and also created these Jacob's ladders that had stories inscribed in them of people that had found their way out of homelessness with the support of Kairos. And it was a very, very emotional opening. A lot of the people that we were talking to came to the opening said they had never had anybody listen to their story. And let alone transcribe it and celebrate it in this way. And it got a lot of attention. A lot of people came to the event and learnt a little bit more about the precarious nature of how easy it is to sort of slip into homelessness. And so it was a sort of tool. And campaigning is something that we also feel very strongly about as a practice. We want to affect change, and getting involved in policy and government and campaigning for things we believe in is very much part, we see, of our role in the world. So it's whether it's through campaigning for design quality in housing, through the Housing Designer Handbook, which was launched a couple of years ago that I co-wrote with David Levitt, and gathering the best case studies of architectural housing projects together from over 50 architects, through to the work of Julia Park, our head of housing research, who's campaigned against the permitted development rights that have been granted over the last few years and resulted in some really terrible office to residential conversions. And that's really gaining a lot of attention now, and yet it's taken a lot of hard work and time, particularly of Julia, to campaign on this issue and make it evident, shine a light on it for people to really understand the issues at hand. And then finally, our work on the LETI Climate Emergency Design Guide, which was launched at the NLA earlier this year, a sellout event at the Building Centre. And obviously there is much more work to do here. Again, this was a collaborative effort with over 100 different architects, and we designed the guide and launched it, and Claire Murray, our head of sustainability, wrote large sections of it with the whole team there, and it feels a very important aspect to campaign about and raise awareness both within clients but also within the architectural fraternity. So I hope this has been interesting. I hope it's given an insight into unlocking social value in architectural projects, but also to have told you a little bit about ourselves and how we foster a sense of social value within our practice. Thank you.
Our last speaker is Chloe Phelps, Head of Design at Croydon's Brick by Brick. She will talk about how the council-owned company is working to become a One Planet Living leader. She will also discuss how they put social value at the heart of everything they do.
Hi, I'm Chloe from Brick by Brick and Common Ground Architecture. I head up the design and commercial aspects of the business. My day job is centred around commissioning design work and ensuring we get the quality we want, as well as doing some direct design work ourselves as Common Ground Architecture, which is an opportunity to practice what we preach and work with other organisations outside of Brick by Brick. To provide a bit of background, we are, in essence, a socially responsible developer for Croydon. We are building hundreds of high-quality new homes across the borough and sending the proceeds to Croydon Council to invest in public services. We operate a new development model, offering 3 ways for the people of Croydon to benefit. Firstly, new homes of all tenures with priority for local people. Secondly, proceeds go back to the council to help fund frontline services. And thirdly, quality architecture for a vibrant and diverse borough. And so a little bit about kind of where we've been so far. We started 4 years ago from a standing start with an aim to build over 1,000 new homes on infill sites around the borough. We're now settling into a programme of delivering around 500 new homes a year. In April, 8 of those first schemes will have been completed and handed over, with a further 17 on site. The top left on this screen shows our first scheme to finish near Crystal Palace, which was designed by HTA, finished before Christmas. And on the right is Common Ground Architecture's first scheme, Pump House, just 2 minutes from Norwood Junction, which will provide 14 new flats and a space for a new library at the ground floor. We have welcomed our first residents who are now living in our schemes. This is a nice lady called Neve, which is a great milestone for us as a business and a good moment to take stock. Reaching this point has allowed us to reflect on how we could better implement our social responsibility, as well as rethinking how we design and build our new homes so that they have minimal impact on our planet. Brick by Brick's aim, above all, is to strengthen existing communities and create homes that are designed specifically to meet people's individual needs. This has led us to start using Bioregional's One Planet Living framework, which is shown on this slide, to work towards becoming a One Planet leader. The framework is built around the 10 core principles that are needed to make sure communities are happy, healthy, and genuinely sustainable places to live. To better understand the potential needs of our developments, Bioregional undertook a local, regional, and planetary needs analysis. This threw out a whole host of interesting stats, particularly around kind of local needs in Croydon. 25% of Croydon residents are under 17, the largest young population in London. 22% of a Croydon resident's ecological footprint is attributed to consumption of food and drink. And Croydon sends over 50% of its municipal waste to landfill, much higher than the 12% national average. So there's a whole heap of these sorts of stats that's kind of really mapping out a massive framework for how we could start to improve on these figures. Following this, we did some gap analysis on the first of our 4 developments that finished last autumn. And from that, we're forming our action plan, which we're currently working on at the moment, which will then become an auditable document that is published on the One Planet Living page. Our first gap analysis review identified that we're already doing a lot of good things. It was just that they were getting unmeasured. This is an excerpt from a report from Ravensdale designed by HTA, a development of 30 new homes on an existing estate which replaced old garages that were no longer fit for modern use. I'll not go through everything, but in essence, the green is good, yellow is okay, but could do better, and the red is areas for improvement. Good things to note are use of local construction firms and employees. We've already got good measures to reduce private car use and homes designed to be comfortable and climate resilient. Things we can do better on already are soft measures to encourage healthy, sustainable diets. We could do a lot more to encourage waste minimisation and waste hierarchy. There could be much better links with local businesses, and one thing that we're already doing quite a lot of work on is starting to sign future residents up to an energy tariff with a renewable energy supplier. So following this work, we have recently published our business plan, which places social responsibility and environmental commitments at the very heart of our operations. In this, we have made pledges against each of the 10 principles, which are set out on this slide. I won't go through every single point, but hopefully you can read them in your own time. We are now actively working to establish our action plan, which in practice enables us to set programme-wide goals and KPIs for how we are going to implement and measure our social value, and ensure we are meeting our commitments and work towards a world where we can live happy and healthy lives within the Earth's natural resources. Some of them are straightforward and easy to implement, and a case of asking for something in our contract documents. Others will take a rethinking of how we design and build, but we're up for the challenge. I appreciate this has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and I've only touched on the very top of what we are doing. But please, if you're interested, do download our business plan and get in touch if you have any queries, and follow us on social media. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you to all our speakers, and also thanks to our housing programme champions, Transport for London, and our supporters for this programme, ACOM and Pollard Thomas and Edwards, and thank you for listening.